right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and call the Transportation and Public Safety Budget Committee to order. First on the agenda, do we have any bill introductions? Seeing none, we're going to proceed on. I wanted just a few items of interest for the committee. I handed some stuff out. I met earlier today with Craig Knowlton, who was our he spoke to us, I believe, a week ago Monday about pay plans at the state of Kansas. And what he gave me was there's a link, and I can share that with everybody, about the compensation and classification for the different positions at the state of Kansas. And just as an example, I've got the engineering tech position in here. I could copy off a couple of others that he gave me, but if you're interested in it, this is the information that's at that compensation and classification in his office that I guess you guys can't punch on that link since it's on a piece of paper. A little humor there. Anyway, I found this to be very interesting, and you may find it interesting once you have a chance to look at it. I also, as Representative Poskin had requested, he gave us a copy of market survey information on some of the positions that we would be talking about in our committee. And we may need to bring him in to get a little bit better clarification on some of this. But as we look across, let's just look at Corrections Counselor 2, the top line. This market rate study was effective as of July 21st. You know, there's 37 employees, I guess, in this designation. The average across the state is $22.99. I thought one of the things that was interesting about the presentation yesterday, I believe one of the conferees mentioned that some of their engineering techs made $19. That still goes along with this, because that $20.54 under engineering tech, that's the average across the state. So it's not the high one, it's not the low one. You know, I'm sure, and then what they determined the market rate to be across the state, which didn't necessarily agree with what we heard yesterday, was $19.43. So if we go up there and we look again at Corrections Counselor 2, the market rate for that position is $25.91, but the state of Kansas average is $22.99. So we're a little bit light on that. He did say that that $22.99 number represented what their base salary is on a permanent basis. So those temporary increases that we saw in the governor's executive order aren't reflected in that $22.99. You can kind of read across the page, but that's what they get to look at on their market surveys. So I think that's good information for us to think about as we go forward. Yes, Representative Dupertain.
Thank you. Just a question on that specific one you're talking about, Corrections Counselor 2. When we look at market rate, what are we looking at? What's the market out there comparison for a corrections counselor?
Well, my understanding, and again, we can try to get him back in here if we want to kind of ask questions of that, is, but like that's what other state governments are paying on that one. Engineering tech, so they've got in-state employers. Let's go down to Corrections Officer 1. They do have in-state employers on that. So my understanding is that's like local government. Maybe the private facility in Leavenworth might be one that they use to come up with that average. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of.
And if you want, we can get him back in here. No, you know, he told me, and I told him.
I just wanted your take on it. And then on the engineering technician one, not to jump around on you.
Right, the job description basically.
It gives pay grades 21, 25, 28, but there's 20 steps in each pay grade. So does it really tell us anything? They're in that pay grade, but are they at step 1 or step 20? There's a huge difference.
Yeah, and go ahead, Merle.
Based on the step, I mean, that would depend on how long they have been in that grade. If they've been in that, you know, if step increases were implemented for that individual, they'll move up on an annual basis. There hasn't always been funding provided that, but so people would be on a range of that pay grade based on their years of experience, loosely.
And is it an assumption, and I've got the chart here, but I'm not going to pull it out, but if I'm making $20 an hour on pay grade 21 and I jump to a 25, do I go back to step one and I'm making $15 an hour, or am I really incrementing on upwards?
Mr. Chairman, so that depends on the nature of the pay increase that's provided, but typically if it's a statewide pay increase, you would move up from that same step up to the next grade to the equivalent step.
Thank you.
And there is some latitude by the people that are hiring new hires on where they put them on that step, or on the step, not necessarily the pay grade scale, right?
That I would have to find out more.
I was thinking they were hiring some people at step 4 for some reason, or step 8, but, and we can get him to come in and talk to us a little bit, but another thing, you know, I know I rolled my eyes a couple of times when I heard about the process that they have to go through to get a wage approved. He said that the smaller agencies do struggle with that a little bit, but the larger agencies, generally like cabinet officer staff, he said their human resource people understand what they got to do and they can get through, and it's not cumbersome for them. They can do it and usually have an answer in 24 hours. So I don't know how that factors into some of the things we want to do, but he said the smaller agencies can struggle getting the information, but like KDOT wouldn't necessarily struggle moving forward. So anyway, I wanted to share that information with the committee as we try to, you know, some of you had some conversations with me, and I know this is a big issue across the state, but, you know, we're going to hear the Sentencing Commission budget. I think they've got their plan worked out, you know, it's worth thinking about it. Kansas Highway Patrol has a budget pay thing. We're going to hear that tomorrow, as does the KBI. You know, we might feel like we want to tweak it a little bit, but it seems like the biggest problems to me were in corrections and Department of Transportation. Just, that's an opinion, you know what that's worth. So anyway, any other questions on the information? All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started on our normal scheduled agenda. The first person on the agenda is Joel Skilly, Director of Policy with the Kansas Department of Transportation, and he's going to talk about the pilot on road usage charges that the state's working on. Welcome to the committee, Joel.
All right, get all my technology figured out and on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about our RUC, or Road Usage Charge Study, that we have embarked on this fall. Let me get the presentation pulled up here. All right, excellent. Thank you. So, again, thanks for the time. We've called this, as you'll see on the slide, a Midwest RUC study, or Road Usage Charge Study. The reason why we called it the Midwest and not specifically Kansas, I'll get into in a little more detail later, but it really is trying to put together a perspective and a voice from the Midwest, Kansas specific, but we're partnering with several of our states that are in our region. One of the AASHTO regions called MASTO, which is the Mid-America State Transportation Organizations. We are actually partnering with most of those states to work with data. They're all supportive of this. We actually are partnering with Minnesota DOT. They're going to actually undertake a small portion of the pilot piece that we'll get to here in my presentation. But the reason, again, why we called it the Midwest is because we want to focus on a larger scale, regional scale, a voice, somewhat what I've called a pragmatic voice to the national conversation that's happening. As you guys have probably seen, the world is changing, especially the transportation world. We have technologies that are coming out that are seeing electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles being talked about. You name it, we've got it almost that's being talked about. All of those vehicles ultimately do not use or utilize motor fuels, whether it be diesel or biofuels or just straight old gasoline. So that definitely impacts each state and quite frankly the country from a revenue perspective when you're looking at transportation investments. All of our transportation investments across the country are somehow formed or funded by motor fuels tax. There are a lot of other fees and taxes that come into it. Different states have different uses that are used to actually bring money in or revenues in to pay for those. But there is a large chunk that is paid for by motor fuels tax. And as we as states start seeing those vehicles that actually utilize motor fuels decline and interest come into electric vehicles and other fueled vehicles, we're recognizing that revenues will decline. So we're not seeing that revenues, as the slide mentions, necessarily decline right now, and our immediate projections are not seeing those major declines, but we are seeing declines out into the further years as vehicles start, again, getting more popular, becoming more easily attainable by folks as far as that goes. And you'll also notice the attainment, it comes from a lot of the vehicle manufacturers. GM has stated, and I believe I just heard this yesterday, that by 2035, they intend to be only offering electric vehicles. I mean, that's it. Electric vehicles by 2035 would be their offering as far as what they're producing. Volvo has done something very similar. So we're seeing this happening. It's not going to be an immediate flip where we're going to see this because people, myself, even I drive a car. I think I've had my car for my previous car. I just bought a car, but for like 10 years. And that's about the average, is people keep a car for about 10 to 11 years right now and then move on to a new car. So that's a fairly long time to have a vehicle. But we see this coming. And so we're planning ahead, trying to get an idea of what might actually work. I think Chairman Francis brought this up yesterday, this big old fancy Ford truck that looks pretty neat. Ford's really been pushing this, and it's coming out this quarter, I think, or possibly second quarter of this year. So this is going to be a game changer, quite frankly. We're going to see this. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Teslas and about some of the other passenger vehicles, but a lot of people see this vehicle and the truck market being a potential game changer. Could be a not fast game changer, but it could be. So we're again trying to keep track of everything that's happening there to make sure that we're again ready. Talk about a little bit about the funding. You'll see in this chart on the left, the pie chart on the left really talks about our revenue mix that we have in the state of Kansas currently today. In 2021, you'll notice about 38% of that is state sales tax. About 22% is the federal fuel taxes, and about 19% is the state taxes. So that, and then we've got other registration fees that actually make up the rest of that funding. If you look at the pie chart to the right, and it kind of is blocked off, I see by the screen, 60% of that in 2045 we're anticipating or projecting will be coming from the state sales tax. 11% would be coming from state motor fuels tax and 14% from the federal motor fuels tax. A big reason for that is because of what we're projecting and anticipating is the adoption and purchase of electric vehicles and therefore then a reduction of motor fuels consumption. So what we're looking at here in that right pie chart really is something that we don't feel is in the best interest of the state or is necessarily sustainable. I don't think that we should necessarily be considering relying on just sales tax as the primary driver for transportation investment. There should be something that's bringing in revenues from the users and that. So that's something that we're exploring, another reason why we're exploring this again, this study. As I think you'll probably hear from some of the other speakers today, one possible solution that's really been focused in on across the country, quite frankly, is moving from paying at the pump, motor fuels tax, to paying for miles driven or a road use charge. So in other words, looking at it from the standpoint of if I have an electric vehicle, I get in the car and I drive from, say, Topeka to Manhattan to go see a K-State game. I'm an Iowa State fan, so I probably won't be doing that unless Iowa State's playing them, but that's an example that you might look to. And yeah, I've made a lot of friends by saying that. Really, you would look at that trip from a matter of not the gallons that you've used because you're in an electric vehicle, but the miles you've driven. Potentially on a state highway because you're on to I-70, then on to 177 and up to Manhattan for the game. So that usage would then be considered as to, okay, how much did I use? And maybe timing possibly or other things would be taken into account based on congestion in certain urban areas going to that trip. Probably not, but those things can all be considered. And those are things that are being discussed now across the country with different states and different entities as to how this might look. Our perspective, and this is where I'm getting back to the Midwest, to the Kansas study, is looking at rural communities, the agricultural industry, and commercial trucking. We've seen that across the country, most of the studies and the pilot programs that have happened have been on the coasts. And you'll probably hear about that maybe to some extent from some of the other speakers today. But mostly it's happening on the East Coast with the I-95 coalition. There's been research and study done. And then on the West Coast, where there's been studies in the state of Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, and Utah. And actually, Oregon and Utah are unique cases where both of those states have now implemented an actual program. Not a pilot, but a program for people to use. Utah is an example that I might mention real briefly here, is that they're looking at and have started a program for electric vehicles that they can either register with an increased registration fee, which Kansas also has an increased registration fee on electric vehicles, or they can sign up to do a road usage charge program where they actually then have a unit or a OBD device that's plugged into their car or some other device that then tracks the mileage that they drive, where they are then charged like a cent per mile or whatever, a percentage of that mileage. And then if they hit that registration fee, so their registration fee, I believe, for passenger vehicles is $120 or something along those lines. If they hit that within a year, that's where it caps out. So that if it's a traveling salesman that drives 40,000 miles a year, he's likely going to hit that registration fee, not going to pay any more than what that would be. Whereas if there's somebody that drives a lot in an urban city or short trips and doesn't drive that much, they could actually pay less than what the registration fee is and actually pay more what they're actually utilizing of the roadways. So those are things that are under consideration and actually being implemented. Again, Utah has started that. Getting back to the Midwest perspective, we haven't seen that in several of the studies. So we really felt it was important to get that voice heard across the country from what do you see in rural transportation? What do you see from the agricultural industry when we're getting our goods to market? What do you see with commercial trucking going across the Midwest with a lot of our goods, again, to market? What we did here in this study is we broke it out, and you'll see here there's 3 phases essentially in this study. It's going to go, we started this fall, it's going to go until spring of 2024. So this isn't a quick process. We're not trying to slam something down and say this is it and we're done. We want to have a very deliberate conversation with the state, with people of the state, to see what their interests are, what their concerns are, so that helps us formulate, one, our voice at the table, and so that we're not being just told ultimately here's what would potentially happen, as well as giving them an opportunity to say, well, if this would happen, how would it work best for us? How would we utilize, how could it be utilized for us best? So most of the pilots, as I mentioned, and studies have really kind of gone out and said, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to say, we've got this pilot, we want you to participate, and here's your dongle or your device to use. Go participate and do it. We'll kind of keep track and we'll give you some fake bills based on what you've used. So you get an idea, we get an idea, that happens. We took it a step backwards in a sense, and we're one of the first, I think, in the country right now to have gone back a step and say, we want to engage with the end user, the local Kansans, the community folks, and say, how should we design this? Instead of saying, here's your dongle here, here's your device, and here's what we want you to do, how do we design this so that it fits for us, ultimately, fits for Kansans? So that's where our second phase, our first phase has been outreach. We've been talking a lot. We did a survey, which I'll get into here shortly, with some of the high points and the high questions that we asked. We've talked with some advisory folks about these things. We really want to get a lot of voices heard, and we've reached out to a lot of different industry organizations, anywhere from Farm Bureau to the Kansas Motor Carriers to the Kansas Corn Association. You name it, we've probably talked to them. League of Kansas Municipalities, Kansas Association of Counties. We've all started this dialogue to help say, hey, give us some information here. We're going to keep you engaged with this as much as you want, but we want to hear from you. We want your voice to be heard ultimately, and that helps us formulate the study and the design. Then, once we've done the design, where we come up with anything from different options, and I'll get into this, I'm skipping ahead a bit here, and then we'll get into the testing phase, where we'll actually ask for participants or volunteers that are interested to sign up to do one of the pieces of this pilot that we're actually looking for. So I've already kind of talked about it, and I know we've got some other presenters, so I want to kind of keep this moving. Phase one, again, engage with Kansans. We really want to be this outward-reaching study, get people involved as much as they want. This is going to be volunteer-driven all the way across the whole state, through the whole program, through this whole study. We aren't going to force anybody to do it, but we want people to obviously feel that they can if they want. Phase two, which is going to start here actually in a couple of months, is where we start talking to more specific focus groups to actually start hearing about how we might design this. And then we move into phase three. Once we've got that, we actually look to say we're going to design something that's going to be no tech, say pen and paper. Go at it and record that and submit it in, to something that might be high tech or something in between. You might have something that literally is just a little mini computer chip that plugs into your car or the OBD device, and all of a sudden you're off and driving, and it just helps record that for you, and you can submit it, and we can go from there. So that there's lots of different options within that that we're going to look to design. Then we'll take about a year to actually run the pilot with people, with volunteers, to actually then collect some data, utilize what their driving habits might be, see how that works, and if it doesn't, then that's good. We know what doesn't maybe work. If it works great, then hey, we know what might work well. But these are some of the things that we're wanting to do. We have no preconceived conceptions that we're actually going to have something put in place. We're not looking to put anything in place. What we're doing is looking to get some information and research so that we can be better prepared come 10 years, 15 years down the road, potentially, when this is really maybe needed, when we really need to switch over. It may be quicker. We don't know. That's the thing, is our crystal ball is not entirely clear on how quickly other fueled vehicles, other than motor fuels or petroleum products, come around. This could be a lot quicker. It could be slower. So let me quickly go through what we're hearing. So we did a survey. We put out a statewide survey. It was online. We, again, sent out the link, I think, to many of you. We hit the legislature. We hit the secretary's web announcement or email blast that I think goes out to 4,000 people across the state. We hit all of those other associations, sent them that out and said, hey, put this out to your folks. Put this out. Have them fill it out. We want to hear from them. Even if they hate it, we want to hear from them. We want to know. That's what's going to help us here. So with that, again, the goal was really focused on rural respondents, but we did get respondents from across the state. We opened it in mid-October and went through the end of December. As I'd mentioned, we sent it out to 4,000 plus stakeholders. Here's what we got back. I was really hoping we'd hit 1,000 people. I really was, and I tried thinking, well, who else can I send it to that might just fill that out 5 times or 6 times? But we hit 925, which was good. not statistically relevant necessarily. Again, we really tried focusing on the rural side. As you'll see, we did get more rural respondents to this than we did urban, but we did get quite a few urban folks and some semi-urban folks. And how we defined those was based on census data, essentially, to define whether it was an urban area or a rural area so that we could get a better feel for that. And it was something that's well used. As you'll notice here, we did get quite a few from around the state, and each of these are our districts, our ks.gov districts. That's how we kind of divided it out. What we heard back, interest in ruck. Actually, we had 60% that responded back that expressed they wanted to either stay informed or even participate in the future phases, whether it be the workshop or pilot design. We had a potential of almost 200 different people that said, we want to participate in the pilot. That was actually really, I liked that. We got a lot of respondents that said, yeah. And quite frankly, there are probably several of them that are like, I want to participate because I think this thing is garbage and I want to make sure that they hear about it. Or I think this thing is great and I want them to hear about it. So I think we're going to have a wide spectrum of folks that are involved and engaged. And that's what's exciting to me about this. The survey was not specifically focused just on road usage charge. So we actually kind of started out, this was the first question. In your opinion, what's the most important issue statewide? And we didn't limit it to just transportation issues. We said, what is and we gave them a list of a few things and they could pick. And you'll see here that the number one was economy and jobs. And that's relevant to us. We want to make sure that we're hearing that because that translates to transportation as well. I mean, we want to have good roads to get to the jobs. We want to have good roads to help build our economy. So again, it all is relevant. Even though it wasn't specific to transportation, that's something we wanted to hear. And it did also say, let me go back to that real quick, 7% said transportation. I think that was interesting because I think that speaks volumes to what you all and what we have been able to do over the years in keeping our transportation system in good shape, a quality transportation system. And we're doing whatever we can under Ike to help make that even a better transportation system with your help. So we, again, really appreciate that. Some more of the RUC survey results. About 41% of the respondents we asked, do you know how much you pay in motor fuels tax as far as like per gallon? Actually, I was a little surprised by this. I thought it would be a little lower, quite frankly. But we had 41% that knew what the state motor fuels tax was. The interesting piece is that second part is that the majority of them don't know how much they pay annually in fuels tax. So you don't really compute, well, yeah, I pay 25 cents a gallon, but shoot, how many gallons do I actually use in a year? I truthfully, I couldn't tell you. How many I use. It's kind of in the back of your head. You don't ever really think about it. It's just there. But it's something that helps us understand better where people are at with what their understanding of how we fund roads, quite frankly, and how much it costs people to pay that. So another question we asked was familiarity. What we did find is that rural respondents were less likely to be familiar with this concept of road use charge. There were more urban folks that actually kind of knew or had somewhat familiar understanding of that. The RUC survey set up really, we kind of put this forward to say, hey, as you'll see here, people who drive less fuel efficient vehicles currently do pay more than people that drive more fuel efficient vehicles. It just happens that way. Road usage charge, where you pay for a mile you drive, how does that impact it? So we were trying to gain whether or not they see that as being more or less fair to go from what you're currently paying as a motor fuels tax or to a road usage charge. Here's kind of what it showed. It's kind of interesting. You'll see that, again, the rural side folks see it as less fair. And that's an interesting concept. That's something, again, that we want to explore because Why is that? Why do people think that that's less fair? There's still quite a few that see it as less fair in the urban areas. So again, it's something that we're trying to then better understand to help kind of fit a potential solution or methodology to moving forward. Here are some of the specific responses that, I won't read all of these to you, and you've got them in your testimony that I provided or the presentation. But it was also kind of interesting.
Can I interrupt you
Yes.
just a second? Does everybody have these slideshows but me? Stop there, too.
Oh, no. Well, I will,
I was just going to ask you would you mind emailing that?
I will do that. And
Mine
actually,
ended right there at what we're hearing.
oh, no.
So,
I will send that. As a matter of fact, Susan may already have it, but I will make sure and send the electronic copy so that it can go out to
Okay.
everybody.
oh, back there, maybe over there on the
And yeah,
counter,
I'm not
maybe?
sure if the copies that are there go past the survey. I am so sorry. Yes, so, yes, definitely.
Are me and Susan are me and Mary Lynn the only ones that don't have the back part of it? Yours ended?
All right.
Okay.
Well, at least I'm consistent in that regard. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. But it's
Good to
great
know.
data and it helps us. I mean, we would love to have
Yes.
that part sent to us and we can
You will
study
all
it
have
more.
Merle, is that on the same thing?
They all end on the same.
All right. Okay, well, good to know. Apologies. So anyway, as you can see on the screen, again, several comments that really came into play, and this is just a sampling of what we heard. We actually had a lot of the respondents, a lot of the 900 people, provide individual comments similar to this, where they want to share their thoughts, their insight, which that was huge for us. We really wanted to hear that. So again, we also set up a website which went out to all of the folks that we sent it out. This is going to be continued to be updated with information. It's got a fact sheet for folks if people have any questions. It's going to be, like I said, kept up to date with new information as we go through this whole study. And really with that, again, I probably have taken more time than I should have. My contact information is here. I'm happy to stand for questions, and obviously, we're going to be working with you guys for the next few years on this.
Yeah, I think it's something we need to get started on as soon as we can. So thanks for taking some leadership on this and starting to talk about it across the state. Questions, committee? Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate you being here. So if we implement this road usage as far as on number of miles, will it be electric only or will it fall over to the gas-powered vehicles as well?
So that's a very good question, and how we would envision it is really just towards the electric vehicles. I mean, if we were to start something similar to what Utah and Oregon have done, this is only to help cover what the electric vehicles really are not paying for the system, other than within the registration fees.
So on that accord, I guess the assumption is the electric vehicles will be powered by lithium.
We tried not to assume any power source short of anything that was not motor fuels or gasoline driven, essentially, or petroleum driven, to not exclude any potential technologies in the future. And again, this is primarily focused on research as to what might work to help collect some sort of revenue based on usage. At some point, if we are so many years down the road and no longer have motor fuel vehicles, whether it's some other thing, that could evolve into something else. I mean, if you're doing a hydrogen fuel cell or hydrogen where somebody's actually going to the pump potentially and
Right.
pumping in, that may be a completely different thing that looks a lot like the motor fuels tax.
And that's what I was leading to, or questioning. If
Yeah.
you get into a hydrogen or ammonia base, which is NH3 with a lot of hydrogen, again, for the fuel cells, eventually it could be a measurable amount again. Or I don't know if lithium is going to take off even short term, or if we're going to come into the hydrogen age.
Correct. Yeah, and I wish I knew, because I tell you what, I'd be investing one way or another, but as well as everybody else. One thing I did not bring up that somebody may also bring up here, but Vermont is a state that did actually look, and I think, Chairman, you brought this up yesterday maybe, or in a conversation that we had. Vermont looked at, yes, okay, explored that, and they found that they were looking to try and find
The
revenues.
rest of the
from
committee
other
what that
states.
is. They
Yes.
explored, tell them what that is.
Okay, so they explored or started researching what legislation could be put in place or a program that could be put in place to actually charge electricity at public charging stations for those electric vehicles to address out-of-state commuters coming into the state of Vermont to kind of collect a revenue from them. Because something else that they found was 80% nationwide, pretty much, of people that own electric vehicles charge at home or possibly at work if their work has it. They're not charging at public charging stations. So what Vermont was looking at is the idea of getting folks that are coming into the state from a tourism or out-of-state travelers. What they found, it was anecdotally, it was not worth the effort because of the challenges and the complexity of all the different charging units that were out there and how people kind of measured that. And then the amount of money that they were going to get was, I think they guessed or estimated it was going to be about $5,000 a year at this point. So it was premature.
Yeah.
It was something that they think it could be an option, quite frankly.
Plus
But
you're
right
turning
now,
your utility companies into the tax collectors at the same time.
Correct.
And yeah, the Vermont looked at the at-home slow chargers overnight, and I can bypass the meters by doing that. And
Correct.
there's gotchas on everywhere here, but.
yeah,
Okay,
correct. And
appreciate you
yes,
diving
I
into
apologize.
it.
That was actually you. I remember now yesterday bringing that up, I think, so.
Representative Weigel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your report. What is the federal tax that comes into the state, and how do we get that? I mean, I'm assuming the feds collect that and then disperse it back. How does that come back to the state?
So it's 18 cents on the gallon, essentially, at the federal rate. And the state rate, as you noticed, is 24 and 26, 24 for motor fuels and 26 for diesel in the state. But at the federal level, yeah, it's 18 cents and it's collected at the rack, basically the same thing, or a little differently. But they distribute it by formula then out to the states. So the
That's why
states...
do they have a formula? I mean, is
Yeah.
it based on vehicles registered in the state or miles driven or?
It's based on a lot of those things. Yeah, there's formula funds that come out to the states, and it's based on a lot of, like, the road miles that we have, vehicle miles driven, lots of different things. And it's actually been in place for decades, quite frankly, and actually is Kansas nets out pretty much what we collect, we get back. And sometimes we get back a little more. So we're what's called a donee state, I want to make sure I get that terminology right, because we're not actually donating funds to other states. We're collecting back pretty much everything we collect in.
Back pretty much what?
And sometimes a little more. So it's actually the way that formula sits right now, it actually helps, or is pretty well balanced.
I have one more follow-up, and when you were talking about these devices that you're going to insert into a vehicle, that's going to be completely voluntary, correct?
Correct. Yeah, this whole
And
thing.
are these devices that are going to plug in, are they just going to capture miles driven for a electric vehicle, or what I'm saying is,
Yes.
I can already envision people calling me or writing me saying, what else are they capturing when we're doing this?
Completely understand, and that's something that, yes, we're very well aware of, and that's not our intention at all. That's not what we plan to do. It's really a miles-based, but those are definitely concerns that we want to be able to address, essentially, and how this works. Because, yeah, there's a privacy issue out there, or concern that's out there. And quite frankly, yes, as I'd mentioned earlier, this is all voluntarily driven. If you want to volunteer and participate, great, we'd love to have you. If not, we're not putting anything in there that you aren't fully aware of what's going to happen. That's where that design phase, what we're doing, we're actually working with these focus groups to help design what we would ultimately use. It may, like I said earlier, it may be just pen and paper, quite frankly. And there's technology out there now that is able to redact and not collect a lot of that data.
Well, I was surprised that some people don't know that there actually are little black boxes now inside your vehicles that monitor your speed if at some point there's a traffic accident or something. I was just wondering if that technology was going to be used in this. So.
That's a very good question, and no, that is not our intent at all. What our intent is really to try and help identify mileage that's driven, used on the state highways. And quite frankly, it could look at how state highways, I mean, it may be just be as simple as like your odometer. It helps kind of collect your odometer. You don't have to write it down, but it collects just your odometer reading from day to day, so it knows how many miles you've driven. The challenges with that, and that's again what we want to hear about, is then you may be paying for, in Kansas, a rate for miles that you're driving in a border state, or miles that you may be driving only on a gravel road, quite frankly. And the gravel roads have a different cost of maintenance than the state highways. So there are a whole bunch of complexities that could potentially be looked at. And that's part of what we want to discover or explore and look at is how do you accommodate that? And to what extent exactly that you look at it and maybe are dealing with, again, the privacy concerns and that. Because, yeah, actually my wife's vehicle will report back to the dealership how many, like, okay, it's time for your service. And then it's like, why are you, but yeah, the OEM, the manufacturers are doing that.
I get texts from somebody saying, and it's amazing how that works. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chair Resman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious, I have to use an example here. So I drive, I don't know, X amount of miles, and let's say over the course of a year, the taxes I'll be paying on all those miles is about $500. But yet if I own an electric vehicle, how do we know we're going to collect that same $500 to ensure that our tax revenues continue to come in at the rate they are?
So that's a really good question. That's something else that we're wanting to discover as part of this study, because say you drive 500 miles or pay $500, but say Representative Weigel drives the same 500 miles, you're driving a, say, Ford Focus that's a 4-cylinder that gets 40 miles to the gallon. Yes, and Representative Weigel is driving an F-350 that gets 10 miles to the gallon. That is a different use, essentially, of the highway system, or Representative Weigel is technically paying more than you are for the use, essentially. And quite frankly, it wouldn't be the same dollar amount. But yes, that's a good question, and that's something that we want to develop or find out really kind of how that works. Because so some of the other programs, Utah, I believe, and I can get back with you on this, and some of the other speakers or presenters may know this, but I believe Utah charges, I think it's like 0.15 or 1.5 cents a mile. They look at the average based on, okay, here's your miles per gallon sort of thing for this type of vehicle, a high fuel efficiency vehicle, those sorts of things. But yeah, exactly. How do you try and create an apples to apples situation? Because again, we're not looking to necessarily bring in more money or double tax anyone here. What we're looking to do is try and find a revenue source that's equitable and yet still provides that value for the Kansas taxpayer.
Representative Delperdane.
Thank you again. Earlier, you had mentioned about tracking even out-of-state visitors as they come through. So again, if we're not tracking where I'm at and when I'm there, how do we know if they're in our state or not?
Well, and that's part of the issue that's out there with this road usage charge is how do you know? You could potentially, again, going back to technology, if you went and used technology, you could potentially put a geofence around a specific area. So you could put a geofence conceptually around the state of Kansas and then know how many miles you've driven in Kansas and how many miles you haven't. It wouldn't necessarily say how many miles you've driven in Missouri and Nebraska or Iowa or Texas, but it would know how many you had driven in Kansas. But again, that goes back to, okay, what levels of technology are acceptable? And that is indeed part of the challenge in trying to do this, especially at a regional or national level, when you get people that are coming in and out of the state, people that, yeah.
George Orwell was right. Thank you.
Your big brother, Representative Delperdang. You know, I do, while all this is kind of hard to conceptualize, you know, I think there is more of this going on in our day-to-day life than we think. I think about the insurance companies now that are offering a discount if they put the box in. I see Mr. Whitaker back there with the motor carriers, and I know for years the trucks, basically their diesel fuel tax has a proration system. Do you know, or should we ask Mr. Whitaker to comment, do they have electronic reporting of that in the big trucking companies?
I would be
Joel?
happy to defer to Mr. Whitaker if he would choose to come up.
Could you maybe address that real quickly? Mr. Whitaker, say who you are and who you're with, so for the record, but.
Tom Whitaker, Kansas Motor Carriers Association. And yes, when we went to electronic logging devices for the time, it also picks up the miles per state. We pay base state. So if I'm a Kansas carrier, I pay Kansas. They distribute the fuel tax revenue, the registration fees to the different jurisdictions. But yes.
And does that box, does it track where the trucker is for for Big Brother to find you? I shouldn't make those jokes. Federal government.
It does track the route you take and the miles in every state, because those are required to have to work with the International Fuel Tax Agreement along with the International Registration Plan.
But doesn't know if I'm in Liberal, Kansas or Topeka?
Only the company can access that, or the auditor from the state.
Okay. All right, thanks. Anyway, they're a little bit more. And then conceptually, are you doing any polling on how often people want to pay? I think that's one of the great things about what we do right now is you need gas, you pay.
Yeah, and again, as I'd mentioned earlier, this system's not, we haven't built or designed anything. This is all going to be based on conversations and facilitated discussions with Kansans, quite frankly, to see how often do you want to pay? Is it daily, monthly, weekly? How often might you want to get a bill sort of thing? Or can I just sign up like if you have a K tag, can I just sign up and put a credit card on there and it deducts every quarter?
Did you do any polling on that yet?
No, we didn't necessarily get into that level of specificity on that, the survey. Really, it was a higher level just to kind of better understand kind of familiarity and interest.
Hey, thanks so much. Look forward to seeing how this progresses.
Happy to be back. Thank you.
All right, next on the agenda, we have Ed Reagan with the CDM Smith Consulting. He's a tolling project director. Ed, is Ed on Zoom or WebEx?
Yes. Yeah,
Well,
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I'll get started. First of all, one little disclosure. I'm retired now after 45 years, so I'm not with CDM Smith anymore. I wanted to say that because I think CDM Smith is involved in the study that was just discussed previously, and I have not been involved in that. I don't really know anything about it. I'm speaking as a expert in a field that in terms of the motor fuel tax, and I've been talking about this stuff for about 5 years. So having that out of the way, what we were asked to talk about was the potential viability of the motor fuel tax as the primary source of transportation funding at a state and national level. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and the increase in electric vehicles, which we've heard a lot about from the previous speaker. I'll touch briefly on that and also look at what it might mean for transportation funding in Kansas. To frame these forecasts I'm going to share here with you today, the baseline is the 2021 Energy Information Administration, EIA, fuel forecast. They do an annual energy outlook for the United States for all types of energy. And the last one that was released was February of 2021, and it actually projected out through 2050. And in releasing their forecast, they made a strong statement that they estimate that fuel sales in the United States will never again reach levels seen in 2019. Now, that was obviously heavily influenced by the fact that we had a big drop in fuel sales in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. But it also reflects the fact that they were basing their forecast on reduced new car fuel efficiency standards that had been suggested in the Trump administration. This forecast was developed in late 2020, as I understand it. And they assume a slight increase in electric vehicle penetration, but actually we found still well below everybody else's forecast. So we developed this presentation today with 3 alternative scenarios regarding electric vehicle penetration in the future. One is the base case 2021 EIA, what they call their reference case forecast, and then an alternative scenario assuming a high level of electric vehicle penetration in the future. And that was adapted from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They do global forecasts of EV penetration. And then a third scenario we created, which is kind of a mid-level, we call it mid-level, basically between those 2 scenarios. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Joel's actually already touched on a lot of these key points, but I think the key is that we've been talking about electric vehicles for a long time, but the shift to electric vehicles is actually becoming a lot more real. Joel already mentioned that GM will only offer electric or plug-in hybrids after 2035, Volvo worldwide after 2030. The success already, pre-sale success of the Ford Lightning truck. I think literally the first year and a half of production of that vehicle is already pre-sold. And most recently, the Biden EPA guidelines target 17% of new light vehicle or new car sales will be electric vehicles by 2026. I don't really think we'll achieve that, but I do want to say that if that was achieved, that's actually higher than our high electric vehicle forecast that I'll talk about in just a second. So at the national level, first thing when we estimate gas tax revenue, fuel tax revenue, and we start with travel. And this chart shows historical from 2010 to 2020 in dark black here, and then from a forecast from 2020 to 2050. The actual vehicle miles of travel demand in the United States. And these are in trillions of miles. So in 2010, total travel in the United States by trucks and cars was just under 3 trillion miles. That grew significantly to about 3.2 or almost 3.3 trillion miles by 2019. Then we see a big drop. Obviously in 2020, it dropped to 2.8 trillion miles. That was totally attributable to the COVID outbreak and the reduced travel and the various restrictions. The light gray part of this forecast is from the Energy Information Administration, and it's what they develop in terms of estimate future growth. And they estimate that by about 2023 or so, we'll be back to the same level of travel that we had in 2019. And then thereafter, they've grown it out at a level of about 0.75% per year. Now, I mentioned my forecasts here have 2 alternative estimates of light vehicle fleet electric vehicle shares. Light vehicles include cars, but it also includes SUVs and pickup trucks and so forth, kind of non-commercial light vehicle transactions. The lower line in blue here is the EIA reference case, the official forecast. It shows a slight increase, gets up to about 8% or so of the fleet would be electric vehicles by 2050, as compared to less than 1% now of the light vehicle fleet. But that's very low. When you look at the high case, which is adapted from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it would get up to as much as 48% of the total light vehicle fleet by 2050. Now, I want to make a distinction here. This is about the fleet or the stock, entire stock. As Joel said, it takes a long time to turn over the fleet. We've assumed in these forecasts about a 10-year lag. So if we have in 2035, in the high case, we estimate the fleet would have 12% would be electric vehicles by 2035. That means in 2025, 10 years earlier, 12% of new vehicle sales would be electric vehicles, which is probably likely at this point in time. In the mid-level, we get up to about 29% by 2050. But the most important thing is we're going to see an acceleration of sales of electric vehicles between 20 and 30, I mean 25 and 30. And then in terms of the fleet, a rapid change after 2030 until we get out. This is, I won't dwell too much on this, but this is a comparison of fuel sales forecasts that we developed based on the EIA projected total travel in the United States and the different levels of fuel efficiency assumptions in the different levels of electric vehicle penetration. I do want to mention that this is affected, by the way, by both of those factors. Because we're talking about fleet fuel changes and increases in CAFE standards, corporate fuel efficiency standards for new car sales, that we're going to see even internal combustion engines significantly increase fuel consumption, even at different size levels. SUVs will be more fuel efficient, you know, in 5 years than they were 5 years ago, and so on and so forth. So we've got two things happening here. We've got the increase in the average fuel economy for internal combustion engines, and we've got an increase in the share of vehicles going to all electric or plug-in hybrid, essentially all electric vehicles. Here you see the orange line at the top, okay, is actually a forecast, which isn't really a forecast. It's purely hypothetical. It basically says that that's what fuel sales would be if there was no change in fuel efficiency. The blue line is what the EIA reference case is, and as you can see, the blue line never gets above all the way out to 2050, that black dot on the left side of the chart. That black dot was 191 billion gallons of total fuel, gasoline and diesel, sold in the United States in the year 2019. That dropped down to about 168 billion in 2020 because of the COVID, but then you can see it grows, and in the blue line, the official EIA forecast, it never gets above that black dot again. But worse is the green and the red line, where we see significant declines in motor fuel consumption down to as little as 118 billion gallons in 2050 as compared to 191 billion in 2019. This is the fuel taxes that will come. This is both gasoline and diesel federal fuel tax. Gasoline tax rate is 18.4 cents a gallon. It's been there since 1993. It's not indexed, and it seems like it's very, very difficult to change. Hasn't been changed in almost 3 decades. The diesel federal fuel tax is 24.4 cents a gallon. So this reflects both diesel forecast and gasoline forecast of revenue. What about the impacts, the net differences between that orange line, if nothing changed, versus particularly the green and the red line? Well, the green line is with this mid-level electric vehicle penetration, and it shows that by 2030, we can expect a 20% reduction in federal fuel tax nationally going into the Highway Trust Fund, which is already broke, by 2030, 8 years from now, not 2050. By 2040, that drop is 33%. By 2050, it's about 40% loss of potential revenue just due to increased fuel efficiency and the shift to electric vehicles. If the high level penetration is worst case scenario by 2050, the net reduction is over 49% versus what it would be with no change. Now let's take a look at Kansas. The current motor fuel tax rates, as Joel mentioned, 24 cents a gallon for gas and gasohol, 26 for diesel, not indexed to inflation, and hasn't been increased, I understand, for many years. You do have an electric vehicle annual registration fee supplement, $100 per year. That also is not indexed to inflation. You're one of several states that are doing that, and that's a good thing. And that generates money, some level of money from vehicles which are not burning any gas and paying any gas tax. This chart shows is a summary of recent Kansas travel, fuel sales, and revenue. I won't dwell on it, just to say that if your left side here shows the annual vehicle miles of travel in the state of Kansas, and it increased from about 30.6 billion miles, these are in millions, so a billion miles of travel in Kansas in 2014, up to a maximum of 32.9 billion in 2018, slight decline in 19, big decline in 2020 due to the COVID thing, down by 10.3%. When we look at fuel sales, follows a similar pattern for gasoline. 2020 gasoline sales was down by almost 11% in the state. But interestingly, in Kansas, unlike other states, there was an increase in diesel sales in 2020, which actually mitigated some of the loss due to COVID. But you still had a 7% drop of total fuel sales. And on the right side, it shows motor fuel taxes, Kansas taxes, not federal taxes, Kansas state taxes, just the diesel and gasoline, and not including that electric vehicle fee, increased from 431.8 million in 2014 up to about 460 million in 2019, dropped to about 430 last year or 2020, and then increased to about 450, and this is calendar year, million in 2021. That's with an estimate for December that I did myself. But basically, we're still 10 million behind where you were in 2019. Here's the historical and projected Kansas vehicle miles to travel. In the interest of time, I'll kind of move quickly there. But again, you see in 2020, the big drop in Kansas. And then in developing a forecast, I did a forecast for VMT growth, assumed about after it recovers back to 2018-19 levels by about 2023 or so, it would grow by about 1% per year for several years, and then 0.75% per year. After I did this, I saw a projection by KDOT, which is slightly lower than that, but in the same general ballpark. These are the alternative estimates I used for Kansas light vehicle, electric vehicle fleet shares, like we talked about on the national level. They're just slightly lower. I reduced the percentiles by about 15%, recognizing the rural nature of the Kansas travel market. This shows the estimated fuel consumption for the state, at the state level, for the different scenarios. Kansas fuel consumption in 2019 was almost 1.89 billion gallons, and that dropped to about 1.75 billion gallons in 2020. Gets back up to by about 2023 at 2019 levels, and then if there was no change in fuel efficiency, it would grow out to about 2.5 billion gallons by 2050. Obviously, lower numbers, of course, for the blue, green, and red, as I've already talked about before. But basically, what this suggests is that by 2040, fuel sales in Kansas will be between 1.3 and 1.7 billion gallons a year. That's a fairly big difference and that depends very much on the percentage of electric vehicles. 2050, it'll be between 1.3 and 1.75 billion gallons. Again, that's against a no change scenario of about 2.5. Revenue, won't dwell on it, but here we see the same relationships in that. But in terms of the relative impacts, just moving ahead very quickly here in Kansas, 2030 levels, I estimate about, if this was the orange line versus the green line, assuming a mid-level electric vehicle share, about 22% hit on revenue versus what it would be if there was no change in electric vehicles or fuel efficiency. About a 35% reduction in 2040, about a 39% reduction by 2050. That a worst case scenario with a high level of electric vehicle penetration, by 2050, you could be looking at a 47% decline versus potential revenue if nothing had changed. But something's going to change. That's a loss of $285 million in revenue by 2050. Now, that does not include the revenue from the $100 electric vehicle fee. And if we have a high penetration of electric vehicles, potentially 1 million to 1.25 million, 1.25 million vehicles in the state of Kansas that are electric vehicles, you would generate between $100 and $125 million a year. But I want to note that's less than half of the hit that you're going to see. Well, why is that? This is important. And that's because the loss of future revenue is a function of both shift to electric vehicles and increasing fuel efficiency among internal combustion engine vehicles. The electric vehicle fee isn't really helping with the second part of it. As a result of this, states are looking for new funding solutions, virtually all states. Kansas is not alone in this problem. All states are looking for new funding solutions. Several states, like Kansas, are implementing special registration fees for electric or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But some states, as was said, Joel said in our previous presentation, some states like Utah, Oregon, are offering an alternative system where people can opt for a road user charging system if they have electric vehicles as an alternative to a flat rate. Some states are looking at interstate route tolling. Several states, Connecticut, Oregon, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, different states have been looking at the idea of adding tolls to existing free interstate highways as a new source of revenue. Got to tell you, that has been a very tough sell at the state and local level. Only Rhode Island, and it has added tolls, and that was to replace bridges on the interstate system, and that was applied only to heavy trucks that do the damage to the bridges. This is not necessarily enjoying a lot of support at the local and state level. Ultimately, as Joel said, we're probably going to see a shift from per gallon to per mile basis of charging. It varies as user charges on how much a vehicle is driven. I'm going to stop there because I think our next speaker is going to talk about what some other states are doing. I'd be happy to answer any questions now or at the end of the meeting if you'd like. Thank you very much.
Great presentation. A lot of information there for us to digest, but yeah, it's one of those things I was really looking forward to. So thank you very much. Questions, committee? Any questions? I've got just one. Would you mind commenting on the problems that you see or don't see with trying to meter at the charging station, like for electricity, kind of like we do with fuel pumps? Have you looked into that much, and what have you found out? Is it a lot like what Vermont came up with?
The answer is always going to be that. Number one, because as Joel said, the vast majority of charging of electric vehicles now, and is going to continue in the future, is at home. And so it's difficult to do that. There may be ways to do it in terms of somehow measuring it, but charging per mile as a measure of consumption is still a much easier way to do it. And it can eventually be applied to both vehicles, both internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. I'm not saying it should right away. I'm just saying eventually you ultimately can have everybody paying an equitable rate. If I could just add one little comment on one of the things that Joel said near the end in terms of the survey, which showed exactly what we've seen on every survey that's happened in the United States. There is a lot of concern, and I think it's very relevant in the state of Kansas. There's a lot of concern among rural populations about this, about the idea of road user charging. And the perception is that if I live in a rural area, we have to drive farther. We have to drive farther to go to the grocery store or whatever. We drive more miles. Very true. Very true. But they also they also burn more gas today. In fact, they probably burn a lot more gas because they may be driving pickup trucks or whatever, as opposed to fuel efficient vehicles. The reason I think that phenomena exists, where there's more resistance to the idea of road user charging at a rural level, goes with the other thing that Joel said, and that is that people don't really realize what they pay for gas tax. They have no sense. When we've done different surveys over the years, you typically get an average answer, right? It must be $100 a month paying gas tax. Not even close. I mean, state gas tax is probably more like $12 or $15 a month. So people think they're paying. They have no idea what they're paying for a gas tax. So they're more sensitive to the fact that if I drive more miles, you're going to charge me more. And they don't even realize that if they drive more miles, they're burning more gas and paying more gas tax. That's a significant issue. And I've heard that many times before.
So what you're trying to say, or what I hear you saying, is that their vehicles in general are more fuel inefficient. So the fact that they drive more miles would be offset with the road usage charge because it would be charged upon the miles driven rather than the fuel efficiency of the vehicle.
Well, the fuel inefficiency issue, while it's true, it actually could turn out to be a benefit of switching to per mile charging. Because basically, if ultimately a state decides on a per mile rate that is not dependent on the fuel efficiency of the vehicle, then somebody who drives a pickup, let's say, that gets 15 miles or 20 miles at a gallon, they may have a charge rate that's based on an overall average of 28 or 30. So they may be doing less. But my point really is that the perception issue, the resistance that the public finds to road user charging in rural areas, is triggered primarily by the fact that the public in general doesn't know how much they pay in a gas tax. So it's almost like it's invisible to them. So it's like I'm paying nothing. And when you put this road charge in, I'm going to start paying for my miles. Reality is they're already paying for their miles. They just don't realize it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Any other questions? Okay. Next on the agenda is Doug Schinkel with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Doug, welcome to the committee.
Hello, Representative Francis. Nice to see you remotely. I hope you're doing well and the committee is doing well. Thanks a lot for having me. I hope to identify Ed to speak to the futurist perspective because you guys asked us and I thought Ed would be able to give you a better sense of what those revenue impacts look like. So I'm hopeful that that was helpful to your committee and the conversations moving forward. I do have a brief presentation, shouldn't take me more than 10 minutes. I did want to speak to that question you just asked of Ed, Representative Francis, about the rural disparities. There's an organization called RUC West, who I think you're aware of. It's basically a consortium of 15 or 16 or so Western states that are kind of studying road usage charges. And they actually did a fact sheet on kind of rural drivers. And let me quote to you, and I'll send this to Merle, but they say, rural drivers will likely save money. RUC West research projects that on average, rural households will pay 1.9 to 6.3% less, and urban households will pay 0.3% to 1.4% more state tax in a RUC system than they currently pay in state gas tax. So I'll share that, but I would echo Ed's points on that. And of course, that does depend on the rate setting, that the amount you're doing per mile, so that could change. But generally, everything I've seen kind of comports with Ed said. So with that, let me just pull up my presentation real quick, and I'll just go through this real quickly and then take any questions if needed. So once again, Doug Schinkel, I'm the Transportation Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures. NCSL is a membership organization that all 7,383 state lawmakers and all the legislative staff that serve them across the country are entitled to our services. So I just want to show you this first slide because I think this is kind of instructive. It's a couple years old. It's from the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. It really mirrors what Joel and Ed spoke to. Just basically, you look at this 2000 pie chart, and highway user fees, tolls, and taxes made up 55% of the revenue mix for states. And you go fast forward 15 years to 2015, and it dropped to 42%. Imagine it's got even worse since then. So just kind of illustrative of what's going on here. I just want to mention real quick, the purpose of my presentation really is to give an overview of what states are doing around transportation funding, but especially as it relates to road usage charges and electric vehicles. But I want to kind of note the obvious that, as mentioned, gas taxes are kind of where states and get most of their, or the majority of their transportation dollars. Since 2013, 33 states and the District of Columbia have increased their gas tax. 23 states and DC do have index or variable rate gas taxes. So there has been action there, but I will note that in this current legislative session, at least 8 states are looking to reduce or get rid of their reduce or temporarily suspend gas tax increases that they've put into place. Davis, I need you to go. Jamie, I need your help ASAP. Sorry, my son is bothering me while I'm trying to present. The dangers of presenting at home. So this next slide is states with fees on plug-in hybrid and or electric vehicles. I'm sorry about that. And as you will note,
it's totally great, Doug. We'd probably rather have Avis do the presentation than you anyway.
Oh man, stressful. Sorry for that. It was pretty terrible timing. So
don't sweat us. The entire state of Kansas is watching this WebEx presentation. So, 30 states have fees on
purely electric vehicles. And of those 30 states, 14 of them have fees on hybrid vehicles. And so you see that on this map here. Those fees range from $50 to $225 per year, with the $225 being the highest in Washington state. That money is mostly used for transportation. It goes into, state transportation funds. There are a few states, Alabama and Colorado are a couple that come to mind, that do take a portion of that money and put it towards electric vehicle charging infrastructure. But really the point of these fees is to help backfill the loss of revenue that's taking place, because you have, vehicles using the roadway and there's not really any way to make them pay into the system. So I think this in a lot of ways is a logical short-term way to try and backfill some of that. And I will note 5 of these states too do have fees. Their fees are kind of like indexed to inflation or something, so they're going up over time, so you don't have to keep on going back and doing so. So I want to mention, obviously, Kansas got a reward jointly with Minnesota this year from the federal government for this STISFA grant program, and Joel spoke to that. But I just want to mention, the history of how many grants have been given out. NCSL was pretty instrumental in helping get this money into the FAST Act, and then making sure it was continued in a slightly different form in the new Infrastructure Act. And this money was really, kind of a strategically thinking that it would be better to start with the states and more at the state and local level to explore these issues, rather than having it be something that was kind of a top-down federal initiative, because obviously there's some drawbacks to that, especially from a communication perspective. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about on the preceding slides is informed by some of this STISFA money that has come in. So this is a map just showing the state road usage charge landscape. It is from RUC West / ORGO, which is the Oregon RUC program. Oregon DOT is the kind of operating entity for RUC West. And this just shows you kind of what's going on in the country. There's a few updates, but you'll see the states in Polka Dot, Oregon and Utah. They have actually operational programs, as mentioned. I'll go into a little more detail on that in a moment. They're soon going to be joined by the 3rd operational road usage program in the country, which will be in Virginia. That was created by state law and signed into law a couple of years ago. And they just, the Virginia DMV just chose their contractor for this effort. The other day, it is Movis. I don't know how it's spelled exactly or pronounced exactly, but they've been doing some work in some other states as well. But that's the contractor that will basically help do the payments and the administration of the system. You'll see a lot of other states doing pilots or kind of studying the issue. I would say the most notable pilots going on right now are in California, Washington, Hawaii, and then some of the work going on along the eastern seaboard. The Eastern Transportation Coalition has done a lot of great work on this topic, especially because, of course, when you get out east, there's much more issue of cross-border traffic, right? You're in states like Kansas and I always tell people where we're based in Colorado, I have to very intentionally drive out of state. So out of state mileage is not really that big of a deal when you live in Denver or, maybe in Topeka or somewhere in Kansas, but depending on the state. But of course, if you live in Kansas City, then that's a much different issue. So let me give you a quick overview. So these 2 programs that are in place, the 2 operational RUC programs, here's a comparison to kind of both of them. They both were created by the legislature. Oregon's conversation has been ongoing since the early 2000s and took a lot longer, whereas Utah kind of passed a bill pretty quickly and they had a program pretty quickly. I would note what the eligible vehicles are. In Utah, it's just full electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, and gasoline hybrid vehicles. Whereas in Oregon, it's any vehicle achieving at least 20 miles per gallon. These are voluntary programs at this point in time. And if you enroll in this program, then you do not have to pay that enhanced electric or hybrid vehicle fee. So they're trying to create incentives to get drivers into this program and see if they can perhaps even save a little money dependent compared to what they would be doing in the system they're in kind of now. And of course, the more drivers you have, the more scale you have, right? So in Utah, I want to say they will have around 4,000. Don't hold me to that, but that's around about how many drivers they have in the system now. Whereas I think Orgo is around 1,000 still. Utah only has one firm doing all the reporting and payment services. Oregon has three: Azuga, Imuvus, and Oregon DOT, because they wanted to offer a hybrid of private and public options because they thought that would resonate with customers. And I'm trying to think, and you'll notice there was a discussion about how much the charge is per mile, and it was correct that in Utah it's 1.5 cents a mile. I think that's going to go up slightly soon, and then in Oregon it's 1.8 cents per mile. They have a kind of complicated formula in Virginia, so I think it depends on how that shakes out, but it'll be interesting what goes on with Virginia. The other point is kind of just to echo, especially what Joel said, that the trade-off here is like there are privacy concerns about this, and that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that if you want a more accurate system, so people in Kansas have a lot of private, people have private lands. You might have a large ranch. Do you really want to pay for miles on your private road? So in some ways, for a consumer, or if you drive out of state, it's better for you to have a more accurate system. But of course, the trade-off is that then there's, something tracking, although tracking is not the best way to put it, a lot of times they're not really going to be tracking and they get rid of the data. And I think just having strong privacy language in there is important. But there is that trade-off with privacy and payments. The more accurate the system you have, that's going to lead to better outcomes for the state and for the drivers themselves. I just want to talk about a few things. Last year, there was a few states that enacted some RUC-related legislation that's worth noting. California extended their road charge pilot program. They've already been doing some, and this is going to be more pilots. They're not yet moving to an operational program, but I'd imagine that might happen at one point. One notable thing that they're doing, and of course is something in California wouldn't be as probably interesting in something that would be adopted in Kansas, that they're looking at how a pilot that could be adjusted based to account for individual vehicle efficiency, basically to tie it to environmental outcomes. But that's most states aren't really approaching it from that perspective, but I'm sure there are some states that are going to look at it from that way. Nevada pass a law to just study some of the things around transportation funding sustainability, including Utah's program. Utah created a special revenue fund to put the money in that comes from the road program they have. And then Oklahoma actually established a road user charge task force. And it might be interesting, Representative Francis, and I'm happy to connect you with whoever the chair is and the efforts going on there, given that that's a neighboring state, to hear what's going on there. I know they just kind of got their efforts just underway, so it'll be interesting. But that wasn't a state that's on my radar. It's good to see more Midwestern states, more rural states that are maybe a little bit more rural in nature exploring this, and not just kind of the coastal states, because I do think we need to have a wide variety of information. One really notable piece of legislation from 2022 that is just introduced and is of course pending is there have been discussions in Oregon and Washington about making these programs compulsory, meaning required for certain vehicles at a certain point in time in the future. And so that's really creating an on-ramp to get the vehicles that are either high fuel efficiency or purely electric, or in this case with the Washington bill, they're saying by 2027, any vehicle in the state, any new vehicle would have to go into that system, even if an internal combustion engine. So I just wanted to mention that. And then one other thing I mentioned, this is kind of a non sequitur, but some states, one other thing, the most other not notable thing states have been doing recently to kind of try and backfill some of their lost transportation revenue is these fees on things like transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft, and just putting in these small fees. And you'll see the states that have the red bordering behind around them. Those are states that they've dedicated some amount of the fees that they're collecting to go towards transportation purposes. And that's another, just looking, states being kind of creative, looking for user fees that are transportation connected out there to go to. And these are a number of NCSL's resources. We do have a road user charge toolkit. It will at one point, so very soon, have 13 fact sheets on most of the states that have got STISVA grants. The most recent one we have up is from Hawaii, and the Utah one should be added within the week. And then that is all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks a lot for having me. And I hope this information has been beneficial, and sorry for the interruption from my son.
Great job, Doug. Thank you very much. Any questions for Doug? Okay. Hey, thank you very much. Next on the agenda is Leighton Yates. He's the Director of State Affairs for the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Welcome to the committee, Leighton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. As you mentioned, I'm the Director of State Affairs for the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. My name is Leighton Yates, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you on EVs from the auto perspective and kind of touching on what some of my previous speakers have addressed in the room. I do have some slides, so I'll get those up for you. All right. So we do represent the entire auto industry. Our members on the automotive manufacturing side, they're responsible for the production of over 99% of all new cars and light trucks that are sold in the US each year. But we also represent tier one suppliers as well as technology companies. Some of those companies are based in Kansas, Ford, GM, and even Subaru has a small office in Kansas. A lot of our policies focused on cleaner, safer, smarter policies. So obviously on the cleaner side, we're very relevant with this EV discussion, but even getting into some of the ADAS, the advanced driver assist systems that keep you in your lane, watch your blind spots, as well as smarter technology getting down to even things like consumer privacy. To give you a snapshot of what the EV landscape is looking like right now, we'll take a look at 2021. So we had almost 15 million vehicles sold last year, and you'll see almost a quarter were cars and about 3/4 were trucks. We'll call them light trucks, and that really includes your pickup trucks, SUVs, crossovers, as well as minivans. And that's a trend we've been seeing as consumers' trends are shifting more towards SUVs and crossovers, and automaker offerings are also growing in that space as well. If you look at the powertrain breakdown, though, you'll still see, over 90% are still internal combustion engine vehicles. And those are your gas and diesel vehicles. Hybrids, conventional hybrids, like your Toyota Prius, for example, are up to 5.4% from last year. And overall, the ZEV market, which we consider your battery electric vehicles, or EVs as we call them, your plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and your fuel cell electric vehicles, that's up to 4.1% nationally, and that's actually the highest mark that we've ever seen in that segment in the US. If you look at Kansas, and we've got sales numbers through September, so you can add in some degree of variance to it slightly. On the hybrid side, about 42,000 vehicles were sold last year, a little over 1,000 battery electric vehicles, and 420 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. You'll see 0 for fuel cell electric vehicles. A big reason for that are if there's no hydrogen infrastructure to fuel hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, there will not be any sold in that area. So typically you'll see them mostly currently on the West Coast. There are some states looking into hydrogen infrastructure. I guess most close to you that comes to mind is probably Colorado. But on the EV side, the pure EV side in Kansas from last year, registrations, registration numbers that we had were only available through June, but there were only about 3,000, a little over 3,000 EVs in Kansas, which is only about, it's less than 1% of the entire state fleet of vehicles on the road. Even if that number went up some from more EV sales, it would still likely be under 1%. And between the EV sales and the registration numbers, that's in the bottom 20 of the US, including Washington, DC. And if you look at the national picture of light duty vehicles on the road, we're almost up to 3 million vehicles on the road. Someone mentioned earlier the age of the vehicles. People are holding on to vehicles longer. Part of it is because of that record and average purchase price of 47,000. I'm going through that now, looking for a new vehicle for my wife since we just welcomed our newborn son last month. So that's making us hold off, and that's making people hold on to their older vehicles as well. The average age that we've seen is around 12 years old, which has continued to grow. But as you can see, cars are still less than that light truck segment, which is everything under that car category: crossovers, SUVs, minivans, pickups, and gas vehicles are still the majority of vehicles on the road, from coast to coast. But to show you what automakers are doing to not only put vehicles on the road, but prepare for it, we've invested, or we have announcements to invest $330 billion by 2023. So that's very, very close, as well as offer from that investment over 130 models on the road. Currently, you can typically find about 50 ZEV vehicles in that segment in the US right now, but by 2026, that number will double. And we hope that'll help consumer choice. To give you a better snapshot, a more visual snapshot of what that investment looks like, this is a good slide I like to use just so you can see the depth of brands that have plans and even their segments. If you look at Volvo, they have plans for no internal combustion engine designs in that 2020 to 2024 segment. Ford has announced, upwards of $29 billion invested by 2025. These are all in the next 2-3 years. So there's very fast moving and very bold plans. Volvo will plan to be 100% battery electric in that 2030 to 2034 segment. You'll see GM will be 100% battery electric, in that 2035 to 2039 mark. And if you look beyond, it's not just making sure the fleets are clean, it's making sure the operations and the manufacturing is clean. And many of our members, both domestic and abroad, plan to have carbon neutral operations going forward. And, all of this is to say that the whole industry is pointing towards electrification. This is a more visual snapshot of one of the earlier slides to show zero emission vehicle market share and the breakdown of the segments. You'll see all the way back to July 18, there's been a lot of variance, ups and downs. Some of that is pandemic and related due to the factory shutdowns and supply chain shortages. But there is a slight increase and it fluctuates. But the fact that it's gotten up to 4.1% overall this time is a positive sign that it's growing. But it's still relatively low in the grand scheme of the national fleet of vehicles out there. You'll see that very few fuel cell electric vehicles have been sold, but we expect that to not only in the future be a big part of the zero emission vehicle segment, but as infrastructure gets built out and it becomes more ubiquitous across the states, not just on the coast, we hope that you'll see more offerings as the years go by. This is a representation from one of our third-party partners. It gives a projected growth of U.S. ZEV sales in the market. If you look all the way up to 2027, it's predicting that the market will almost be 15% ZEV by 2027, and I realize that's 5 years out, and this is an optimistic projection and is an estimate in itself. And you can also see the breakdown of the segments from battery electric to plug-in hybrid electric. And you'll see, as I mentioned, fuel cell electric vehicles will become more and more a part of the equation as infrastructure gets built out, more offerings are available. But it will require significant investment, from automakers, from government, as well as consumers as they shift their attitude in purchasing. And just to give you a snapshot of what will be needed, I know we're speaking on investment, but it's been estimated that by the end of 2030, our country will have needed to invest upwards of $30 billion for public charging, and that is from your fleets, whether that's private fleets. You think of your state fleets, state-owned fleets, that is, public and private charging, your workplace charging, as well as home, because most people charge 80% or more charge at home. And that's not just single-family homes, it's also multifamily dwellings, your apartment buildings, and your condos. And, you know, a lot of that will come down to all levels of government as well as private investment. This is another kind of snapshot of just to show where we are, just from public commitments, from public utilities, private investment, money put forward by the states. It basically highlights, so while there's been 4.5 billion committed, you know, that essentially, if you compare it to that last slide, there's about a $35 billion shortfall that hasn't been accounted for yet. And, you know, states are in the planning stages, some further than others, and some should be along further than others, just based on EV registrations in their states and how far along they are with their infrastructure. But a lot of that has been in, you know, two main states on the opposite coast, California and New York. But we hope to see that change. And I know that states are struggling with finding ideas to help make that change. But before I get into the funding mechanisms, you know, I wanted to just show a snapshot of how automakers are seeing the grand scheme of the pie, if you want to call it. Obviously the infrastructure piece, but the cost, making sure that the vehicles are affordable and the fuel is affordable. The production, making sure we're investing here domestically, not only in our factories, but also in our labor force and our supply chain. And eventually, you know, the consumers are the important part, making sure they're familiar with the vehicles, what they're able to do, providing them more choices, and not just, you know, a small two-seater EV, but all the way up to something you can take off-road. And we're seeing some of those now with the pickups and some of the heavy-duty vehicles. There's a plug-in hybrid Jeep out there, and we expect to see more as more manufacturers come to market, and as our existing manufacturers provide more offerings. And there's a lot of stuff we can deep dive in on that, but we do have a document we can share with you, Chairman, if you like, and happy to provide that afterwards. But on the EV fee side, this is the most common form of states trying to recoup or make up for EVs on the road and not paying the motor fuel tax. There's about 30 states right now with EV registration fees. Just from my territory, for your reference, I cover the South and the lower Midwest and all the way to the actual Colorado. And I would anticipate that some of these brown states will fill in by the time session is over this year. And some of these fees may go up or down. The fees range from $50 all the way up to $225. Some of the higher ones aren't necessarily based on fairness or equity. And some of them have been seen as, you know, a tax on green energy, while some have been seen as too low and not, you know, charging a higher net fee to recoup that lost gas tax money. Kansas right now, as you heard, is $100 in EV registration fee and $50 for the different types of hybrid vehicles out there. But there is no solution, or I guess de facto answer to this. We've seen different options, and the fee base by vehicle, and that's what I just touched on, the registration fees. We've seen the fee based on mileage, which Doug and Ed, and they've been able to provide some great information on. With VMT, there are some consumer privacy concerns, and you know, I think as pilots work themselves out and there's more data on just how to best run a RUC or a VMT program, I think you know, it'll show its benefits. But we've also seen fees based on gross vehicle weight, and you know, we've seen plenty of studies show that the vehicles putting the most damage and force and impact on the road is heavy-duty trucking, upwards of, you know, the impact of 4,000 to 6,000 cars from one 5-axle truck. So EVs damaging the road more than a light or internal combustion engine vehicle. That argument is not too strong of an argument. And there's also federal investment coming, and I'll touch on that to just help in the short term with preparing for EVs. But our stance on this, we don't want to tell a state how to tax itself. We just ask that whatever those fees or taxes are, that it's comparable to what someone with an internal combustion engine vehicle is paying in that state gas tax each year. Just based on our math, it's about $100 for someone in Kansas, give or take $10. And the vehicle miles traveled for that person per capita in a year. So we think it's equitable and comparable right now. I think it's only, 2022? I think it was only passed in 2019, so it's only 2-3 years old at this point. Speaking of the federal side, the infrastructure bill in Congress, they finally were able to pass something. And luckily it benefits the states and the infrastructure side, which is an important piece of this discussion. There's $7.5 billion that's available for states now. The $5 billion portion of it is based on a program or a formula that will allocate money to the states. Kansas, I believe, is at $40 million, and that's over 5 years. And there's also a $2.5 billion bucket of money that is based in grant programs. One will be based along federal highways, the Clean Corridors program, but there's also a community grant program that can be used for more targeted EV infrastructure projects, not along those highways in communities, throughout your state or another given state that wants to apply for it. And lastly, I just wanted to give you a kind of better picture of where Kansas lands with all of the infrastructure funding bill allocations. Like I mentioned, 40 million, and that's based on population and vehicle registrations. But 40 million is a great down payment to get that process started, and hopefully Kansas and other states will take advantage of it and hopefully get ahead of it and save themselves and their consumers some money. But that is all I had as far as slides for you. Happy to answer any questions.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Yates or any of the other conferees? All right. I think everybody's ready to move on to the next thing we have to do tonight, aren't we? Don't look at me like that, Representative Ellis. All right. Thank you very much, Leighton. Great presentation, like always. Thanks for helping us with this.
Thank you, Chairman Francis.
All right, committee. I want to remind you, I'm not sure the new agenda's got out yet, but tomorrow we're going to have salary presentations on Kansas Highway Patrol and KBI, their wage proposals that are in the budget. So if there's nothing else for the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.